Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to, what day is today? Wednesday. Today's Wednesday, October 14th, apparently, at 10:06 a.m. So, what should we do? Yes, we're in the middle of a documentary. Before we get back to that, I just wanted to say, don't forget your papers are due on Friday. And then I would like to have a little quiz next week, maybe on Wednesday? Is Wednesday okay, or Tuesday?
On which topics?
On, let's say, classes 11 to 20. Today is class 25 or so.
Wednesday.
Wednesday? Wednesday? Okay, let's do it Wednesday. I'll post something in Microsoft Teams. It'll be kind of the same idea as last time on classes 11 to 20, so I'll post that. We'll do that on Wednesday, next Wednesday. Also, this is probably a good time to point out that to sort of reaffirm the policy, because it's pretty light attendance here today. So if you're online and you're in another country, of course that's fine. If you are in Vancouver and you're not sick, you should be here, okay? So this is, the online thing is in case you get sick or in case you are overseas. It's not, you're not supposed to kind of drift in and out as you feel like it. So if you are in Vancouver and you're not sick, you should be here, okay? So that said, who's here? So Claire's here, good morning to you, unless you've spoken to me otherwise. Adil's here, good morning to you. Vicky, hello Vicky, good evening. Daniel's here, hello Daniel. And Sala's here, good morning to you. And Gabrielle's here, hi Gabrielle. Okay, so yesterday we were talking about, we were watching this documentary, The T Word, in which actor Laverne Cox goes around the US and talks to a few transgender youth, right? And so we hear a little bit about their experiences and what they think and feel and what's happened to them, and a little bit about who they are as people. And I asked you a bunch of questions, and so maybe, I asked you, what? Yeah, we got to 7. I'm just wondering if we should review them now or if we should just watch the rest and then go over all of them. Just in case anything else comes up in the last little bit. Watch first? Okay. So that's what we'll do. Good morning. That's what we'll do. We'll watch the rest of the documentary and then we'll come back here and talk about it, okay? So I don't know how much is left, maybe about 15 minutes or so. So online people, what I'll do is I'll turn you loose and I'll let you watch the rest of it. So yesterday we watched 25 minutes of it. So today we'll watch the rest of the 25 minutes and then we'll come back here and talk about it. So I think there's 15 minutes left or so, I'm not sure exactly. But online people, go to Microsoft Teams, find a link, watch from 25 minutes to the end, answer any questions that we haven't answered, and then we'll come back here and talk about it, okay? So yeah, go do that. We'll do the same thing here. Okay, and we're back. All good? Good, good? Okay. So, very quickly, there's nothing on the screen. Very quickly. So, in what ways does socialization play a role in the lives of these young people? We talked about it yesterday. George? What's that? Comfort? Give me more.
It can be like comfortable, like being around with people instead of just being alone and dealing with the world.
Okay, so they're certainly trying to find a place of comfort, right? They're trying to find a place for themselves in society and find a place that is accepting of them, right? What else? What else?
They experience sanctions and punishment.
Yeah, yeah. They've been sort of socially sanctioned or kind of socially punished, or in some cases actually physically punished. And why is that?
Because they're not socially accepted in society.
Right. There's to be transgender is not acceptable in society, right? There's no, traditionally speaking, there's no room for these people, right? There's no acceptance of them. People don't know what to think about them or how to behave towards them, and so they are sanctioned, right? And in some cases in sort of very subtle ways, but in some cases very overt, direct ways as well, right? What else? Give me more.
As the dress codes are socially constructed, then they were forced to wear like girlish or boy clothes until they found their true identity.
Right. So clothing is gendered, right? And so in some ways it symbolizes who we are as people, right? I think we choose clothes that we think either represent us as individuals or that will allow us to kind of be accepted in society, right? But also it marks the gender that we are, right? And so lots of these transgender young people were clothed in the gender that or clothed in clothing that was associated with their sex assigned at birth, but really that wasn't who they are, right? So they use clothes to communicate to the world that this is actually who I really am, right? And so Zoe, the young girl who's always in pink, is a good example of that, right? She's a girl, that's her gender identity, and she expresses that to the world very clearly, right? She likes very girly things. She likes lots of pink and fashion and, you know, her hair and makeup and all those things. She likes things that are very girly, and so she is very clearly communicating to the world, this is who I am, right? And so, again, socialization can kind of work against you, right, in terms of sanctions or in terms of, you know, your parents dressing you in the wrong clothing, but also they can use it to their advantage, right? You can, if their gender identity is female or male, they can very easily communicate that to the world with how they dress, right? And Zoe and Avery and Lorraine, well, basically all of the young people that we met communicate their gender identity to the world based on what they wear, right? And maybe that's a little more obvious with the girls, but also with the guys, right? We saw Shane and Ari and Kai, all of them dress like young men, right? So they can communicate who they are to society. So again, socialization and gender roles work both ways. They can work against you if you're being forced to behave as the gender that you are not, but also you can use those things to communicate to the world who you actually are, right? And we see that all of those young people are doing that. Anything else in terms of socialization and how it affects young people? I guess the other thing we could probably say, and I think, Anna, you brought this up yesterday, is that if these young people are successful in communicating their gender to the world, then there's a better chance that they will be accepted, right? And I'm not saying that that's the way it should be, but you know, the more, let's say Avery, because she was talking about being clocked, right, or passing privilege, the more she looks like a girl, the more easily she will be accepted by society, right? Because most of society is still thinking of a male-female gender binary. So if she wants to be a female, the more feminine she is, the more she will be able to kind of fit in, right? The more masculine she is, or the more ambiguous her gender is, the more it will confuse people, right? And so, again, this is where gender non-binary people have more of a challenge because they don't clearly fit into one gender or the other, and so people aren't sure how to think of them or how to behave, right? But we don't really have any of those people here. Most of these people are identifying themselves as man or woman, and they are kind of trying to fit themselves into that existing gender role, right? So I think we see that, right? All of the guys kind of want to be guys, all of the girls kind of want to be girls, and there's no one for whom gender is, not important, or that they don't fit into those. So that's another thing. We said yesterday that some of these people, how do they know their gender? And we found that, they just seem to know, right? And interestingly, from a very early age. Some people, I think, would like to convince us that, it's, someone has encouraged this, right? Or has, somehow pressured or influenced them to do this. But again, do you think someone could try and convince you that you're another gender? Do you think like I could convince you that somehow you are not the gender that you think you are? Probably not, right? You just kind of know, right? Like I instinctively know that I am not a woman. Like I know that. I don't think you could tell me or show me or convince me in any way that I am in fact not a man. I think that I do know that, right? And so similarly, I think we probably all know what our gender is, and so do these young people as well, right? You can't train people to be a gender that they're not, right? I'm going to come back to number 3 in a minute, and number 5. Why did we say that Kai was asked so many questions about his gender identity rather than his basketball playing? We had a few ideas around this, I think.
He's the first trans athlete.
Right, there was a bit of novelty there, right? He was kind of the first professional trans athlete, so people perhaps understandably had some questions, right? However, what else did we say? What else did we say?
Genders are very different, so when it comes to sports, it's important to know where you stand, especially when the sport divides competitions into males and women.
Yeah, his occupation as professional athlete is a gendered or a gendered profession, right? If you're an accountant, there's no difference between a male and a female accountant, right? An accountant is an accountant. They're all boring. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. But an accountant is an accountant, right? There's no division about male or female accountant. However, when you're a professional basketball player, that activity is gendered, right? There's women's basketball and there's men's basketball. And so suddenly Kai, formerly playing in women's basketball and then now identifying himself as a man, that raises certain questions. Where does this individual now fit? Where do they play, considering we have a gendered activity, right? So again, and maybe that's a legitimate question too, right? I don't know that there's anything wrong or discriminatory or problematic about simply asking the question, right, of where does this individual now fit, right?
Especially in wrestling, when there's a trans person and they start taking testosterone, for example, if it's a trans man, they start taking testosterone, it's still not enough to fight against the guys. You always see this fight accordingly, you see them losing out. But if they join the women's side, because of the testosterone they are taking, they have an unfair advantage. And then when it's a trans woman, it's the same thing with the women.
Right. So we have a situation where, statistically speaking, men tend to be stronger and have more muscle mass than women do, in general, right? That's not always the case, but statistically speaking, it's true. And yeah, many trans men are taking testosterone to, make themselves more manly, which they might want, right? And Kyle
Pretty strong.
Kyle mentions that, right? Before he was taking his testosterone, he went in to order a roast beef sandwich, and his voice was too high, right? So Kai sort of wants to present himself to society as a man, and those injections are part of that. But again, do those injections give them an unfair advantage in one category or another? Where should they be? With whom should they be competing? And it's a question that has to be resolved, right? George, what does it do? It is an androgen, so it is a hormone that women have as well. So both men and women have estrogen and testosterone, but men produce a lot more of it. And it, in part, it allows us to gain greater muscle mass, makes us a little hairier in general, it makes our voice lower, etc. So it's a male androgen. It's kind of a male sex hormone, and it is partly responsible for some of the physiological changes or physiological differences between men and women. Can make us a little more aggressive or assertive as well. So. Yeah, so again, trans men will often take testosterone injections, and actually men who are older will often take testosterone injections as well, because as you age, your testosterone production can decline. And so some older men will have testosterone that they'll take. And similarly, trans women will sometimes take estrogen. And so if you inject estrogen, your body fat index will increase, your voice will get higher, you will be less hairy, and so on and so forth. And so there's two hormones, both men and women have them, but men have more testosterone, women have more estrogen. And so those can help with those kind of secondary sex characteristics if you want to present yourself to society as one or another. Or if you're aging and that hormone production is declining, some women will take estrogen when they get older. Some men will take testosterone as well if you go to your doctor and they recommend it. What does Vicky say? Oh, he's a public figure and there's lots of bias. So yeah, there's lots of bias, and yeah, he's a public figure, and so public figures get more attention than others. What was I referring to with the resume study? Do you remember? Not sure if I had a clear point there or not.
We had a stereotype, like we view them with another view.
Yeah.
We see them differently.
Yeah, we a set of filters come down, right? And so Kai's a basketball player. People are asking Kai about basketball, and then suddenly we find out that, oh, Kai is a transgender person, right? And so suddenly we are seeing Kai through the lens of a transgender person, and we kind of lose track of the important thing, which is that he's a basketball player, right? And so all of these kind of stereotypes and ideas we have around transgender people and maybe prejudices start to express themselves, right? And so, suddenly, people are asking Kai, oh, do you have a crush on any of your teammates? Well, again, nobody asks LeBron James or Kobe Bryant if he has, well, Kobe's dead now, right? Yeah. Well, let's not talk about that. So nobody asks any other male basketball players if they have a crush on their teammates, right? And again, their sexuality has nothing to do with their athletic performance, right? And so here, we're kind of seeing Kai through the lens of what we think we know about transgender people. And so again, the questions that come at Kai once he starts expressing himself as a man, some of them are, warranted. There's a bit of novelty there. Some of them are legitimate questions about competition because sports is a gendered activity. Some of them are, kind of inappropriate, right, and shouldn't be said. But again, people kind of lose track of what social norms to follow, especially when they're encountered with something that's different, and especially when, they might not have a lot of experience with transgender people at all, right? Why do we say that some of the male students were uncomfortable with Ari being in the boys' locker room?
Because the boy perceived Ariel as a girl.
Right. So they weren't, I guess it's kind of a similar question to the last one. They weren't really sure how to perceive Ari as well, right? So they were having trouble seeing Ari as a young man, right? So they were unsure about his gender and also about his sexuality, right? And often we get confused about these two things because we often assume that they go together. And again, the locker room thing is confusing as well because locker rooms and bathrooms are gendered, right? We have men's and women's bathroom, but really what we're talking about is, or really what we're assuming is sexuality, right? We're assuming we don't want guys, in the girls' locker room staring at all the girls. But again, we're assuming that everyone is heterosexual, which they're not. So bathrooms and change rooms are kind of a weird thing in which we're conflating, fancy word, we're combining two things. We're combining gender and sexuality, and we get them confused, right? They're all tangled up with each other, and it's hard to separate them. And so these young men are kind of expressing that, right? They don't want Ari in the locker room. They're saying, oh, he was watching us pee, which Ari says that's weird. Nobody watches anyone pee. What are you talking about? And again, is Ari straight or gay? Seems to be straight, right? He's had lots of girlfriends, apparently. Way to brag, Ari, but he's apparently had lots of girlfriends. He seems to be pretty excited when Rachel shows up at his birthday party, seems to have a bit of a thing for Rachel. So yeah, is he checking out the other guys in the locker room? No, he doesn't care, right? So again, these guys are expressing a bit of discomfort because they're not sure how to, they're not accepting of Ari's gender identity, and they're confusing gender and sexuality, right? And again, those are not the same thing. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit more today, but why is dating difficult for trans people? Because what?
Because transgender was like the original gender was like the same gender as what you're gonna date. So I think that's
Well, maybe, right? But we definitely see that with Avery, right? So Avery's doing some online dating, and she's been messaging a guy back and forth, and then she kind of lets him know, hey, by the way, I'm a trans woman, right? And so how does that turn out for her in this case? Yeah, he says, yeah, I'm not really into that, sorry, right? And so she's a little bit sad, which is fair, right? All of us, nobody likes to be rejected, especially when we're, excited about a new person potentially, and so the rejection is hurtful and sad for all of us. Yesterday we talked about the fact was it okay for that young man to reject Avery?
Yes.
Was it okay?
Yes.
Why?
Because like when it comes to dating, it's another level. You can reject whoever you want.
It's another level, right? What else is it?
it's a free choice. Like you can't force someone to be with someone. So they, for example, if they're even not gay or like normal people will tell you, you know.
Yeah, it's not a forced situation, right? You can choose to be with whoever you want, or you can choose to date whomever you want. What else is there going on here? Is it okay for him to? So Gabrielle says here, yes, because we're allowed to have preferences as long as we aren't rude or offensive. I think that's fair, right? And it seems like that guy was I guess he could have done a slightly better job in letting her down, but he wasn't rude, right? He said, sorry, I'm not into that, right? Which, again, I'm sure was hurtful to her, right? That rejection is always hurtful. But, yeah, but he wasn't rude, and he said, you know, that's not what I'm into, right? And the other thing that we should add into this is there's probably a sexuality thing happening as well, right? Because, you know, we should think about that in this case we don't really know much about Avery, but, you know, Avery is a woman. Her gender identity is female. She's expressing herself to the world as a woman, but anatomically speaking, you know, she has male genitalia, right? And so that's a thing, right? And so some people might not be into that, and I think that's okay, right? That's understandable because, again, all of us have a sexuality as well, and we don't choose that sexuality. And so, you know, just because, you know, we might not want that for ourselves in terms of a dating relationship, you know, I think as long as we don't discriminate against those people in other ways, I think that's okay, right? Because again, you don't entirely choose who you're attracted to in any way, right? Whether it has to do with gender or whether it has to do with anything else. And so, you know, I think it's fair for that young man to say, yeah, you know, you're really nice, but I don't want to date you. And there could have been 1,000 other reasons why that young man felt that way. This happens to be a thing for him, right? And so I think it's okay for him to say no to that, even though I'm sure it was hurtful to Avery. And, you know, I guess it would be nice to live in a world where nobody cared about anyone else's genitalia, but that's kind of part of sexuality, right? That's attached to sexuality, not just, you know, the 99% of the body that is outside of the genitalia, but also that, right? That's also a thing. And so I think it's okay as long as people are let down easy, right? And of course, she mentions in the documentary that in some cases she has to be careful who she discloses her gender identity to, right? Because again, she looks quite feminine. She can walk down the street. She says she's got passing privilege, which again is what? What's? Yeah, the ability to kind of walk down the street and be perceived as the gender you're trying to be, right? And so Avery can pretty much do that. She can walk down the street and she just kind of looks like every other girl. Probably nobody, you know, is able to identify her as a trans woman. Some people do, but again, she has to be very careful who she discloses to. And why is that? Why does she have to be careful? Right? She could be victim of crime or violence against her. And why is that? Right, and so again, gender and sexuality can get kind of tangled up and confused here, right? And so, you know, if a guy goes on a date with Avery and he thinks that she's a cis woman and he thinks, wow, I really like this girl, I think she's totally cute, this is going to be great, and then he finds out that she's a trans woman, for some guys that can be really threatening, right? Suddenly they question their own sexuality. You know, they think, oh gosh, am I gay now because I was attracted to this trans woman, which of course you are not, right? She's expressing herself as a woman. You're attracted to women. That does not make you gay. However, some guys can have a strong reaction to this. A lot of guys are very homophobic, right? And so sometimes that sort of challenge to their identity can create a strong emotional reaction, right? And that can manifest in terms of violence towards Avery. So Avery and the other trans women that we met, Daniela, Lorraine, Laverne Cox, Zoe when she starts dating, all of them are going to have to be very careful who they disclose their gender identity to, right? They have to make sure that that person is safe because they can very easily be the victims of violence, right? I think we've kind of covered all of them. Last question, and then we'll have a break here. Why are trans women like Daniela so vulnerable? So Daniela expressed her or recounted her experience of being raped, right? And what happened to her? She was raped by a man, and then what? And then what? I don't know that she mentioned the police in that. Right, she went to the hospital. So, yeah, Lorraine was talking about the police, but Daniela was talking about the hospital. And what happened with the nurse?
The nurse thought she was like a random prostitute, trying to claim that she's been raped, but she's not.
Right, and so she goes to the hospital, and they do what they call a rape kit, and so they collect they're trying to collect DNA evidence that that this woman has been raped, so they can use it to charge the rapist, I guess. But then, so the nurse is talking to her, and then Daniela tells her, oh, that rape kit, you can't really do it because I'm a trans woman, right? I don't have a vagina, is what she's saying. And so suddenly the filters come down, right? Oh, she's a trans woman. And more importantly, not more importantly, but in addition, what is she? No, she's not. But what is she in terms of social groups?
Black.
Yeah, she's a black trans woman, right? And so suddenly the filters come down, and the nurse makes the assumption, oh, here we have a sex worker, right? And so she starts asking her all of these questions about, are you sure? Are you sure you're not a sex worker? Are you sure this wasn't prostitution? Can a prostitute be raped?
Yeah, possible.
Can they be?
Yeah.
Of course, right? What defines a rape or a sexual assault?
Not giving consent.
Not giving consent, right, to the activities. So can a prostitute say no?
Yeah.
Yes, she can, right? Or he, and as the case may be. There's male prostitutes. So yeah, prostitutes can be raped as well, right? And so, but again, those filters come down, and suddenly Danielle is fighting this prejudice, right? Are you sure? Are you sure you're not a sex worker? Are you sure, this isn't prostitution? Are you sure this guy just didn't pay you, and so now you're going to call it rape, right? And so again, suddenly she's had this terrible traumatic experience, and because of who she is, because of her identity, she's going to be seen through the lens of a black trans woman, right? Which is assumed that she is a sex worker. So Jack mentions here, I have a question, can transsexuals change their physical bodies? So the term you're looking for is transgender, Jack, because again, it's not necessarily their sex we're talking about, it's their gender. But yeah, so you can have surgery to convert male genitalia to female genitalia or female to male. I think the male to female is easier and more successful. I think female to male is a little more tricky, but it's possible. It's expensive, but it can be done. Some transgender people choose to do that, or at least have the money to do it. Some transgender people don't have the money to do it and don't do it, or they just simply choose not to, they don't want to. So you can use surgery to make yourself more feminine or make yourself more masculine. It depends on who you are and whether you have the money and whether you actually want to do that, whether that's an important thing for you to do or not.
Have any of them gone through surgery, like the people inside?
How many people have the surgery? I think it's tough to know for sure. part of the problem here is that people who are transgender often don't want to disclose that to everyone. So there's not kind of clear statistics about how many people, say in Canada, are transgender. The surgery to, if you want to change your sex, so if you want to get breast implants, for instance, or if you want to get bottom surgery, as they often call it, to switch your genitals, those aren't covered by Canada's healthcare system. So you have to pay for it yourself. It's very expensive. Often people will go to other countries to have it done. And so there's kind of no clear statistics on how many people are transgender, how many people want to have the surgery, how many people do have the surgery. We don't really have a way of tracking that sort of thing, and so it's hard to know. It's hard to know. Some people certainly do, some people do not, but it's hard to know for sure, because there's kind of no way to collect data on that. So what's that? Hormone injections are common and probably the simplest, and even though they're not cheap, they're probably the cheapest way to kind of get your physical body to align with your gender identity if you're a transgender individual. And so, yeah, the testosterone and estrogen injections are fairly easy to come by. Again, they're not cheap, but they can help you at least present yourself to society as the gender that you want to be seen as. Yeah. Oh yeah, so the last thing I'll say, and then we'll go on a break here. Yeah, so Daniela's vulnerable here, not only because of the stereotypes around Black trans women, but also because of intersectionality, right? And so she belongs to multiple minoritized groups, right? She's a woman, which is a minoritized group, right, in North America, globally. She's a trans woman, which actually puts her in a even more minoritized group. And she's Black, which is also a minoritized group in the United States. And so she's kind of in multiple groups at the same time. And so that puts her at an even greater disadvantage than than people who were, say, just Black or just a woman, right? And so she's kind of in multiple minoritized groups. That makes her even more vulnerable than the average person, right? Okay, whew. Let's take a break, and we'll come back and we'll do something else. Okay. Okay. So we are back. So kind of interesting, right? Has anyone, I don't know if I ever mentioned or if I asked this before, I think I didn't, but has anyone actually met a transgender person in real life?
Yeah.
A lot of people?
Yeah, Thailand. Thailand.
Thailand.
Thailand.
Yeah, a lot.
Thailand is a
Lady voice.
yeah, there's like a show for
What's that?
there's like a show for transgender at Thailand.
Oh yeah, so there's a lot of transgender people.
Yeah, people go there for surgery.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, so Thailand is kind of a hub for that, especially and for the surgery as well. So yeah, but in Canada or anywhere else?
One of my closest friends is trans.
Yeah. And so without saying too much because we don't want to disclose anything that we shouldn't. But did you hear some of the same things that your friend might be experiencing in the documentary?
It's mostly just pronouns because he does not have parenting privilege.
Right.
But the thing is, he has a very accepting family who decided they provided him with all the resources he needed and required.
Yeah.
And he has a girlfriend, but relationships are hard because sexual intercourse is a very big part of relationships, and that always became a problem that ended it, even if it was like 3 years.
Right. Yeah. So that's a couple things, right? Is that the people that we met in this particular documentary, for the most part, I think had passing privilege for the most part, right? Shane and Ari, I think if you walk down the street, you wouldn't really think anything of them. Probably Daniela and Avery, if they walked by you, you wouldn't notice. And so lots of the people in this documentary have passing privilege. But again, if you don't, right? So if you are, a trans man and you look a little too feminine, then people are going to feel something's off, right? And similarly, if you are a trans woman, but you happen to be, 6'2" and 220 pounds, then it's going to be more difficult for you to present yourself as a woman, right? So in that case, you might face more discrimination. People might have more trouble with the pronoun issue, right? Calling you he or she or referring to you as a man or woman because you don't fit into their idea of what a man or a woman should look like, quote unquote. And yeah, and within relationships, sexual intercourse is a thing, right? Because genitals are part of our sexual identity and sexual orientation. And when you have, genitals of the opposite gender that you are presenting yourself as, or that you're living your life as, or that you identify as, yeah, that can be problematic, right? In physical terms, but also in sort of psychological terms, right? The other thing I wanted to point out to you in terms of psychological terms is something Ari says, which I think for me really kind of stood out, is that he said, that he was, he always kind of identified himself as a boy, right? His sex assigned at birth was female, but kind of always felt like a guy, didn't really identify with girls. And then he says, yeah, and then, when you get to be 11 or 12 years old, your body starts going through the wrong puberty, right? And I was like, oh God, right? Because puberty's tough enough, right? Your body starts to change and you feel awkward and it's weird and uncomfortable, and sometimes you look a little awkward. And so puberty can be tough for anybody, right? But imagine going through the wrong one, right? Imagine, becoming Ari and his body is trying to become more female, right? And so difficult, right? Real difficult. And so that kind of stood out for me, right? Is that in a way, the feeling must be that your body is trying to betray you, right? It's trying to become the gender that you aren't and don't want to be, right? So really difficult situation, especially for a society and maybe an education system and maybe even a family that doesn't understand and doesn't support that. And fortunately for some people, unfortunately for some people, they don't have that support. Fortunately, some people do, right? And we see in the documentary, fortunately, people like Ari and Zoe, they seem to have a strong family around them that that supports them, right? And so, you know, as they mentioned, that can make huge amount of difference, right? If at least your family can support you, even if your school or your society doesn't entirely, at least not yet. Okay, are we good with that? That's all good? Okay. I'm glad you brought up the pronoun thing, and I wanted to leave it off here because I wanted to talk a little bit more about, about the pronoun situation. And I wanted to talk about it to do with this guy here. Has anyone heard of this guy?
He's handsome.
He's handsome. Look at that handsome devil. Anyone heard of him before? Okay. So obviously his name is Jordan Peterson. He's a psychology professor at University of Toronto. University of Toronto is in Toronto, as you might guess. It's probably one of Canada's more prestigious universities. Most of our universities are kind of on the same level. I think in the States they have a little more of a hierarchy, right? And so some are Ivy League colleges, universities, and some are just kind of so-so, and some are not very good. Here in Canada, I think they're all pretty much on the same level, the big ones. But UT is kind of old and a little bit prestigious, and a lot of, you know, famous Canadians have gone there, and so it's, you know, it's maybe a step up from other universities. But he is a professor at U of T, and you know, studies psychology and teaches classes on psychology. Prior to a few years ago, nobody knew who this guy was, unless you were studied psychology or unless you were in one of his classes. Unless you were in one of his classes, most people didn't know who he was. But a few years ago, he got himself involved in a bit of a controversy, okay? And I'm not sure if I have a slide on this, but I'll explain it now. The controversy was that the University of Toronto sent around a memo to instructors and to staff and said, you know, increasingly there are students who identify as other genders, right? So they identify as male or female, or they identify as gender non-binary or gender fluid. And we would like you, instructors and staff, to ensure that you are using the pronouns that students would ask you to use, right? And so, for instance, if Kang came to me and said, hey, I would like you to refer to me as they, not as he, then the university is asking me to respect Kang's request and to do that, right? And so that's what went around. Dr. Peterson here disagreed. Dr. Peterson felt that the university shouldn't be forcing him to speak in a certain way, and he kind of pushed back and said he wouldn't do that. And so this kind of exploded into a bit of a controversy that he kind of found himself in the middle of very quickly, this use of pronouns. And so I wanted to just take a little time to discuss this, but also to maybe exercise our critical thinking skills if we can, okay? So just as a quick review, critical thinking is about asking whether the things that we believe or that other people believe are actually worth believing. Should we accept these things as true? And again, the better reasons people give us for their beliefs or their claims, then the more likely they are to be true, and you know, the more comfortable we can feel about agreeing with them or believing them, right? So we said that critical thinking and arguments are based on claims, right? People saying that things are either true or not true, or things are a certain way or aren't a certain way, right? And so these statements can be kind of organized into an argument, right? A conclusion that is kind of the summary of what someone wants you to believe, and then the reasons that support it, right? The reasons that you should believe it. And of course, you'll remember I had a little argument about the fact that you should all drink coffee because it's delicious and inexpensive and helps you study. And again, we went through the paces of kind of evaluating that argument, but it was an argument nonetheless. And so here what I'd like you to do is read a short article that discusses this controversy, okay? So the article is from a few years ago, I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So this isn't a fresh, hot debate that's happening now, but it is very recent. And it talks a little bit about the controversy around this pronoun use at the University of Toronto and of course in general society, and what Jordan Peterson can and cannot be forced or compelled or asked to do, okay? So what I'll ask you to do is I'll ask you to read the article and try to come up with the two sides to this argument, right? And so there's two clear arguments that are kind of outlined in the article. I'd like you to try and figure out what they are, and then we can decide whether this is a significant issue and how we should kind of look at it, and how do we come to a decision about it, okay? So the questions sort of, questions 3 and 4 we can kind of deal with a little bit later, but I want you to try to identify the arguments. And it might be a little tricky because the arguments are not clearly identified, right? And so it's much easier when someone says, you should drink coffee because of this, this, and this, right? It's great when people outline their argument that clearly. But here, the way this article is written, it's not entirely, the pieces aren't laid out clearly for us. So we're going to have to try to piece this together and figure out what people are actually arguing. As a hint, sometimes the title is helpful in determining people's arguments. And I think in this case, the title of the argument, or the title of the article is helpful for determining what the arguments are, okay, as a little hint. So we've got, how much time do we have left in class here? 20 minutes? No, we go to 11:45, right? Okay. I'll give you 15 minutes, and then I'll check back in with you at 15, and we'll see if we're done or where we are, okay? So I'm going to put 15 minutes on the clock. Of course, you'll find it in Microsoft Teams under Files, and it's called, I think it's called He Says Freedom, They Say Hate, okay? So you should see it. You should see it there. All right. Okay, people, so how'd that go so far? Are you done reading? Did you make...
Professor is like famous, right?
I'm not sure how internationally famous he is, but I think in Canada his name is well known at this point.
He wrote many books.
Yeah, but they would have been books that most people didn't read. Like, if you were like a psychology student or a psychologist, you might read them. If you're a regular Canadian, doubtful. Although maybe now that he's much more popular. But prior to 2017, nobody knew who the heck this guy was. Okay, so unless you were super into psychology or you were a psychology student at U of T, nobody knew who this guy was. So yeah, he's written books. Have they been read? Probably just by academics. But sorry, Jordan, if you're listening. But did you make it all the way through? Okay. Can you start to see some of the arguments that are being made here? So let's just say, what's one argument? What's the conclusion of one argument?
Peter doesn't like the idea of using pronouns that are made like Z or like pronouns. Like he doesn't believe people invented those pronouns.
Close. Okay. So Jordan Peterson's argument is that, yeah, or maybe more specifically that he shouldn't have to. Nobody should be able to make me or anyone else use these pronouns, right? That's his argument. What's the opposing side's argument? Right. So people should be allowed to be addressed by the pronouns that they want to be addressed by, right? So we have two sides of the story focusing on pronouns, but of course, I think as you probably realize, there are other issues at play here as well, right? It's not just about he, she, z, she, whatever, they. This is not just what it's about. There's more going on here, right? But again, the argument is centering on just a few tiny little words that are inconsequential, or maybe not. But that's all the time we have. So come back tomorrow and we will pull this argument apart. There's tons to talk about in here. This is actually a really interesting, situation. So we'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow. Online people, thank you. Good participation today. I'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.